Paul McCartney lost his mother at 14, and that pain gave birth to melodies that would save the world. Before he became the most successful songwriter in history, before he conquered stadiums and defined generations, Paul McCartney was just a grieving Liverpool boy learning to transform death into music and music into life itself. Every song he would ever write traces its roots back to one devastating Halloween in 1956, when love ended and art began. October 31st, 1956, Mary McCartney dies of breast cancer, leaving behind a husband, 2 sons, and a 14-year-old boy who will spend the rest of his life trying to fill the silence she left behind. The cramped kitchen of 24th Lynn Road falls quiet except for tentative piano notes drifting from where Paul sits, his fingers finding keys like prayers, searching for something, comfort, escape, meaning in a world that suddenly feels impossibly cruel. Music becomes salvation that Halloween morning. The melody emerging from Paul's grief is simple, almost childlike, but it carries the weight of loss and the stubborn insistence of hope. He doesn't know he's composing "When I'm 64. Doesn't understand that this moment of private sorrow will one day become part of humanity's shared soundtrack. He only knows that when he plays, the pain becomes bearable, that melodies can carry what words cannot express. The house falls silent except for the sound of a boy learning that music isn't just entertainment, it's survival. Jim McCartney, recognizing something profound happening, understands his son isn't simply playing piano but discovering that songs can transform suffering into beauty, that in the darkest moments melody might be the only light that remains. This is where it all begins, not with screaming fans or #1 hits, but with a motherless child finding salvation in sound. Paul McCartney will grow up to write songs that unite stadiums, soundtrack first kisses and final farewells, prove that music might be the closest thing to magic this world possesses. But it all starts here, at this kitchen piano with tears and tentative melodies and the revolutionary discovery that love and loss are inseparable, that beauty often emerges from pain. The boy playing piano that morning, transforming grief into something the world will one day sing along to, is learning his first and most important lesson. Music can heal what seems beyond healing. He will spend the next 68 years proving this truth, using melodies to save others from their own darkness. The last Beatle standing is discovering that songs can indeed rescue both the singer and the world. To understand how this grieving Liverpool boy became the keeper of humanity's musical conscience, we must first understand the world that shaped him. A post-war city where dreams seemed impossible and music was often the only escape from lives that promised little beyond hard work and small hopes. June 18th, 1942. Paul McCartney enters the world during the Blitz, born into a Liverpool scarred by German bombing and British resolve. The city of his birth is a place where survival itself is an art form, where working-class families measure wealth not in pounds, but in the ability to keep hope alive when everything else crumbles. The McCartney family, Jim, Mary, and eventually Paul's younger brother Michael, embodies Liverpool's essential mixture of humor, stubbornness, and unshakable belief that tomorrow might be better than today. Music saturates the house at 24th Lynn Road like warmth from a coal fire. Jim McCartney, despite his day job selling cotton, fills their modest home with melodies from his ragtime piano and stories of his days in Jim Mack's jazz band. Mary, a midwife who brings life into the world while working impossible hours for modest pay, provides the emotional anchor that keeps the family steady through post-war uncertainties and rationing that makes luxury a memory. Paul's earliest memories are soundtracked by his father's piano, BBC radio programs that provide escape from rebuilding and hardship, and the gradual realization that music isn't just entertainment. It's a language that speaks to something deeper than words can reach. When Jim sits at the piano after long days of work, playing the standards he learned in his youth, Paul watches with the intensity of a student studying scripture, absorbing lessons about how melody can transform ordinary moments into something approaching sacred. The Liverpool of Paul's childhood exists caught between its industrial past and an uncertain future. The docks that once made it one of Britain's most vital ports are slowly declining, leaving behind a generation of young people who must choose between accepting limited prospects or daring to dream of something larger. Music offers a third option, the possibility of transformation, of transcending circumstances through art, of discovering that creativity can be its own form of rebellion. School provides structure but little inspiration for Paul, whose attention inevitably drifts toward the melodies playing in his head rather than mathematical equations or historical dates. His teachers recognize intelligence but struggle with a student whose mind seems more engaged by imaginary symphonies than classroom lessons. Paul learns early that he inhabits two worlds, the practical realm of school and family expectations, and the infinite universe of musical possibility that exists whenever he closes his eyes and listens to the songs emerging from his imagination. The defining trauma arrives when Paul is 14. Mary's diagnosis with breast cancer, her rapid decline despite medical efforts, and her death on October 31, 1956. The loss devastates the family, leaving Jim to raise two teenagers while processing his own grief and forcing Paul to confront mortality at an age when most boys worry about football scores and school dances rather than the terrible fragility of love. Paul's response to this trauma reveals the character that will define his entire career. Rather than retreating into bitterness or self-pity, he throws himself into music with desperate intensity. The piano becomes his confessional, his therapy, his means of communication with emotions too large for ordinary conversation. Songs emerge from his grief, not polished compositions but raw expressions of pain, love, and the terrible beauty of impermanence. Music becomes salvation. The boy who emerges from this crucible understands that life is fragile, that love must be expressed before it's lost, that melodies can transform suffering into something that touches other people's hearts. These lessons will inform every song he writes, every harmony he crafts, every performance he gives for the next 6 decades. The stage is set for Paul McCartney to discover his destiny. But first he must meet the other restless Liverpool teenager who will become his creative partner, his greatest inspiration, and eventually his most complicated relationship. The boy who learned to process grief through melody is about to encounter another young musician who channels anger and wit through rhythm and rebellion. July 6, 1957. The St. Peter's Church Garden Fete in Woolton provides the setting for one of music history's most consequential encounters. Though the teenagers involved have no idea they're participating in a moment that will reshape popular culture. Paul McCartney, 15 years old and carrying his guitar with quiet confidence, arrives to watch a local skiffle group called the Quarrymen perform on a makeshift stage. The lead singer is John Lennon, a year older than Paul but decades ahead in terms of attitude and rebellion, where Paul projects careful charm and musical precision. John radiates danger and unpredictability, singing with aggressive energy that suggests he's settling scores with invisible enemies. When the Quarrymen launch into their set, Paul recognizes something electric in John's presence. Not polish or technical skill, but raw charisma that transforms simple songs into statements of intent. Two motherless boys discovering each other through music. After the performance, Paul approaches with his guitar, and what happens next becomes legend. He plays 20 flight rock with such technical skill and musical understanding that John, despite his carefully cultivated indifference, recognizes he's encountered someone special. More significantly, Paul demonstrates his ability to play songs correctly. Not approximately as John often does, but with proper chords and precise technique. The dynamic established in this first meeting will define their relationship for the next 13 years. John providing raw energy and rebellious spirit, Paul offering musical sophistication and melodic genius. They recognize in each other something missing from their individual approaches to music. John needs Paul's discipline and harmonic understanding, while Paul needs John's edge and unwillingness to compromise. Music becomes brotherhood. Within weeks, Paul joins the Quarrymen, beginning a creative partnership that will revolutionize popular music. Their early collaborations reveal the magical chemistry that emerges when contrasting strengths combine. John's words carry the weight of working-class anger and sharp observation, while Paul's melodies provide emotional accessibility that makes even rebellious messages feel like invitations rather than attacks. But friendship also carries the seeds of future conflict. They share working-class Liverpool backgrounds, absent mothers, and music obsessions, but their personalities often clash in ways that create both friction and creative energy. John's cynicism balances Paul's optimism, while Paul's commercial instincts complement John's artistic integrity. But these differences will later become sources of resentment when success tests their partnership. Their songwriting process becomes a unique fusion of individual talents. They typically write separately but come together to refine and complete each other's work, with John contributing verses that challenge and provoke while Paul provides choruses that unite and uplift. The songs that emerge, starting with simple rock and roll numbers but gradually becoming more sophisticated, reveal two young men learning to speak a new musical language. By 1960, the group has evolved through various names and lineups before settling on the Beatles, with George Harrison on lead guitar and eventually Ringo Starr on drums. But the core creative engine remains the Lennon-McCartney partnership, two Liverpool teenagers who discovered they could create something together that neither could achieve alone. Music becomes revolution. The early Beatles years in Hamburg and Liverpool clubs provide crucial education in performing, songwriting, and the brutal realities of the music business. Paul learns to command audiences, to deliver performances that transform casual listeners into devoted fans, to write songs that work not just in bedrooms and rehearsal rooms but in front of paying customers who demand entertainment. As the Beatles prepare for their breakthrough moment, Paul has evolved from a grieving boy at his mother's piano to a sophisticated songwriter and performer ready to help lead a musical revolution. But success, when it comes, will test not just his talent but his character, forcing him to navigate fame, creative pressure, and the gradual transformation of his best friend and creative partner into something resembling a stranger. 1963. The screaming begins at the London Palladium and never really stops. Beatlemania explodes across Britain with the force of a natural disaster, transforming four Liverpool musicians into something unprecedented. Global icons whose every movement is scrutinized, whose every song becomes a cultural event, whose every breath seems to matter to millions of teenagers who find in the Beatles' music something their own lives have been missing. Paul McCartney, now 21, discovers that fame is both exactly what he dreamed and nothing like what he expected. The boy who once played piano to escape his mother's death now performs in front of crowds so loud that the music becomes secondary to the experience of collective hysteria. Yet somehow his carefully crafted melodies still reach their intended targets, still provide the emotional connection that transforms strangers into believers. Music becomes universal language. The Beatles' success reshapes not just their lives but the entire landscape of popular music. Their early hits, Love Me Do, Please Please Me, From Me to You, reveal a songwriting partnership operating at unprecedented levels of productivity and quality. Paul's melodic gifts combine with John's lyrical wit to create songs that work simultaneously as dance numbers, emotional statements, and glimpses into the inner lives of young people coming of age in rapidly changing times. But success also reveals cracks in the foundation. The pressure of constant touring, recording, and public appearances leaves little time for the careful collaboration that defined their early work. Songs increasingly become individual efforts that receive collaborative polish rather than true joint creations. And the differences in their personalities, once complementary, begin creating friction. Paul emerges as the group's de facto leader, the member most comfortable with press conferences, most diplomatic in interviews, most concerned with maintaining the Beatles' public image. This role comes naturally to someone who learned early to please others and avoid conflict, but it also positions him as the target for John's growing resentment about being managed and controlled. The touring years reveal Paul's extraordinary abilities as a live performer. While John projects rebellious energy and George provides musical sophistication, Paul becomes the group's emotional center, the member who ensures that even in arenas where their music can barely be heard, audiences leave feeling they've experienced something transformative. His bass playing anchors their sound, his vocals provide melodic beauty, and his stage presence creates connection with crowds that range from intimate clubs to massive stadiums. Yesterday, written entirely by Paul and released in 1965, marks a crucial turning point. The song's sophisticated melody, melancholy lyrics, and string arrangement demonstrate capabilities that extend far beyond rock and roll, suggesting a songwriter capable of creating music that transcends generational and cultural boundaries. But its credit to Lennon-McCartney, despite being entirely Paul's composition, highlights growing tensions about creative ownership and public recognition. Music becomes artistry. The mid-1960s albums, Help, Rubber Soul, Revolver, showcase Paul's evolution from gifted young songwriter to mature artist capable of extraordinary range and depth. Songs like Michelle, Eleanor Rigby, and Here, There and Everywhere reveal someone discovering that popular music can carry the emotional weight traditionally reserved for classical compositions or literary works. But artistic growth occurs alongside increasing personal isolation. The Beatles' fame makes normal relationships nearly impossible, forcing all four members to live in a bubble where authentic human connection becomes increasingly rare. Paul responds by throwing himself even deeper into music, using songcraft as both creative outlet and emotional refuge. The decision to stop touring in 1966 marks the end of the Beatles as a live performing unit. For Paul, who thrives on audience connection and immediate feedback, this transition to purely studio-based work represents both liberation and loss. Studio freedom allows unprecedented creativity, but it also removes the direct audience connection that once energized his performances. Music becomes isolation. As the 1960s progress, Paul finds himself caught between his role as a Beatle and his emerging identity as an individual artist with interests and ambitions that extend beyond the group dynamic. The young man who once found salvation in simple melodies is discovering that success creates its own complications, and that sometimes the price of achieving your dreams is losing the simplicity that made the dreams possible. 1967. The summer of love finds the Beatles at their creative peak, but fracturing in ways that will prove irreparable. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band establishes them as artists capable of transforming popular music into high art. But the very success that validates their artistic ambitions also exposes fundamental differences in how each member envisions their future. Paul McCartney, now 25, has become the group's driving creative force, the member most invested in maintaining the Beatles as a functioning unit. While John explores Eastern philosophy and experimental art with Yoko Ono, George develops interests in Indian music and spirituality, and Ringo focuses on acting opportunities. Paul channels his energy into elaborate musical projects that require the kind of group collaboration that once defined their success. Music becomes obsession. The Magical Mystery Tour project, conceived and largely driven by Paul, reveals both his creative ambition and his growing isolation within the group. His vision for a surreal television film accompanied by innovative music represents exactly the kind of experimental work the Beatles should be pursuing. But his bandmates approach the project with diminishing enthusiasm, treating it more as Paul's personal obsession than a genuine group effort. John's relationship with Yoko Ono becomes the catalyst for changes that threaten the group's existence. Her constant presence in the studio violates the Beatles' unspoken rule about outside interference in their creative process, and her influence on John's artistic direction pulls him toward avant-garde experimentation that has little in common with the Beatles' collaborative approach to music making. Brotherhood becomes conflict. Paul's response reveals both his strengths and limitations as a leader. He attempts to maintain group unity through increased productivity and ever more elaborate musical projects, believing that if he can just create the right song or concept album, he can recapture the magic that once made the Beatles feel inevitable. But his efforts to control and direct the group's activities only increase resentment from bandmates who no longer share his vision. The recording sessions for the White Album in 1968 become a microcosm of everything going wrong. The album's 30 songs represent unprecedented individual creativity, but they also demonstrate how far the four members have drifted from their earlier collaborative spirit. Paul's contributions, Back in the USSR, Blackbird, Let It Be, are essentially solo performances that happen to feature other Beatles as backing musicians. Music becomes separation. This period sees Paul beginning to plan for a post-Beatles future, even as he publicly insists the group will continue indefinitely. His relationship with Linda Eastman, whom he marries in 1969, provides personal stability and creative partnership outside the increasingly dysfunctional Beatles dynamic. Linda's influence helps Paul begin envisioning himself as an individual artist rather than simply one quarter of a collective identity. The Let It Be sessions in early 1969, filmed for what becomes a documentary about the group's disintegration, capture Paul at his most desperate and determined. His efforts to salvage group unity through forced cheerfulness and relentless productivity create some of their most powerful music while simultaneously documenting the death of their partnership. The famous argument between Paul and George during these sessions, where George threatens to quit if Paul continues his controlling behavior, crystallizes everything that has gone wrong. Paul's insistence on perfectionism and group discipline, once sources of creative energy, have become sources of resentment and conflict. Abbey Road, recorded after Let It Be but released first, represents the Beatles' final collective masterpiece and their most obvious farewell. Paul's contributions, Come Together, the medley that closes the album, demonstrate his continued commitment to the Beatles as a creative unit while acknowledging that their time together is ending. Music Becomes Farewell. The album's success provides bittersweet conclusion to the Beatles' recording career, proving they can still create transcendent music while confirming that their personal relationships have deteriorated beyond repair. For Paul, Abbey Road represents both vindication of his leadership and evidence that leadership alone cannot save relationships that have fundamentally changed. As 1969 ends, Paul faces the most difficult decision of his career: whether to continue fighting for a Beatles reunion that may no longer be possible or desirable, or to accept that the greatest creative partnership in popular music history has run its course. The boy who learned to heal through melody must now learn to let go of the very thing that made his healing possible. April 10th, 1970. Paul McCartney announces his departure from the Beatles through a press release that reads like a death certificate for the most successful band in music history. The statement is characteristically diplomatic, but beneath the careful language lies devastating truth. The creative partnership that reshaped popular music has become a source of more pain than joy. Music becomes betrayal. The immediate aftermath positions Paul as the villain who destroyed the Beatles. Fans who once screamed his name now accuse him of selfishness, of putting personal ambition above group loyalty, of killing the band that gave meaning to their adolescence. The irony cuts deep. The member who fought hardest to keep the Beatles together becomes the one blamed for their dissolution. Paul retreats to his farm in Scotland with Linda and their children, seeking refuge from public recriminations and private grief. The man who once commanded stadiums full of adoring fans now finds solace in agricultural work, in simple rhythms that provide stability while he processes the magnitude of what he has lost. But even in isolation, Paul cannot stop being a musician. The farm becomes a makeshift studio where he begins creating music that reflects his new circumstances. More personal, more experimental, less concerned with commercial appeal than with emotional honesty. Music becomes salvation again. The album that emerges from this period, McCartney, is rough and unpolished compared to Beatles' productions, but it reveals an artist learning to trust his individual voice rather than seeking validation through collaboration. Critics compare every song unfavorably to Beatles classics, questioning whether Paul possesses the artistic depth necessary for sustained individual success. The formation of Wings in 1971 represents Paul's answer to these questions. Rather than pursuing a traditional solo career, he creates a new band that allows him to maintain the collaborative spirit that energized his best Beatles work while establishing his identity as a leader and primary creative force. Wings becomes Paul's vehicle for proving that he can create meaningful music outside the Beatles' context. Music becomes vindication. The early Wings albums receive lukewarm critical reception but demonstrate Paul's determination to rebuild his career from the ground up. Songs like Maybe I'm Amazed and Band on the Run gradually establish his credibility as a solo artist, while live performances allow him to reconnect with audiences who remember why they fell in love with his music. More challenging than professional reinvention is the personal cost of the Beatles' breakup, particularly the deterioration of Paul's relationship with John Lennon. Their friendship becomes a series of public feuds conducted through song lyrics and press interviews. Paul's Too Many People seems to reference John and Yoko. John responds with How Do You Sleep?, which attacks Paul's music, personality, and intelligence with vicious precision. Music becomes weapon. These musical arguments devastate Paul more than he admits publicly. John was his creative partner, his closest friend, his musical brother. And now he's become an adversary who uses their shared musical language to inflict maximum emotional damage. The songs they once wrote together to heal the world's heartbreak now become ammunition in their private war. Linda McCartney emerges as Paul's anchor during this period of professional uncertainty and personal pain. Her love provides the emotional stability that allows him to survive the Beatles' dissolution without losing his fundamental optimism, while her presence in Wings offers musical partnership that, while different from his collaboration with John, proves equally valuable for his artistic development. Music becomes renewal. The mid-1970s see Wings achieving commercial success that validates Paul's post-Beatles career choices. Band on the Run becomes both critical and commercial triumph, while songs like Live and Let Die demonstrate Paul's ability to create music for context beyond traditional rock albums. His success begins shifting public perception from the Beatle who destroyed the band to the Beatle who successfully moved beyond the band. December 8, 1980. The phone call comes at dawn, London time, carrying news that will haunt Paul McCartney for the rest of his life. John Lennon has been shot and killed outside his New York apartment by a deranged fan. The creative partnership that defined the Beatles, the friendship that shaped popular music, the complicated relationship that deteriorated into public feuding and private grief, has ended not with reconciliation but with violence that makes reconciliation impossible forever. Music becomes memorial. Paul's immediate response reveals the depth of his shock and the complexity of his emotions. His seemingly inadequate public comments about John being a great guy mask devastating grief. He has lost not just a former bandmate, but his closest creative collaborator, the person who understood his musical ambitions better than anyone else in the world. The song that emerges from Paul's grief, Here Today, becomes one of his most personal compositions. Written as a conversation with the absent John, it captures both love and regret. What about the night we cried? Because there wasn't any reason left to keep it all inside. The song acknowledges their feuds while affirming the deeper connection that survived all their disagreements. Music becomes regret. John's death forces Paul to confront the permanence of their unresolved conflicts. The angry songs they exchanged during the early 1970s now read like lovers' quarrels between two people too proud to admit they still needed each other. Paul must live with the knowledge that they wasted precious years on pride and resentment, that their last conversations were marked more by hurt than by healing. The 1980s see Paul achieving unprecedented commercial success, but this occurs against the backdrop of ongoing grief and the gradual realization that he is now the surviving Beatle, the member who must carry forward their legacy while pursuing his own artistic development. His collaboration with Michael Jackson on Say, Say, Say represents both creative triumph and personal betrayal when Jackson subsequently purchases the rights to the Lennon-McCartney catalog, outbidding Paul for ownership of his own songs. Music becomes stolen legacy. The incident reveals how completely the music business has changed since the Beatles era, and how vulnerable even the most successful artists remain to corporate manipulation. Paul loses control of the songs that defined his youth, the melodies that emerged from his grief and friendship with John, the musical diary of their shared experience. His work during this period increasingly reflects on themes of memory loss and the passage of time. Songs like Yesterday take on new meaning when performed by a man in his 50s rather than his 20s, becoming meditations on mortality and the preciousness of moments that seemed infinite when they were being lived. Music becomes survival. Linda's battle with breast cancer, the same disease that killed Paul's mother, tests their relationship while demonstrating the depth of their connection. Her death in 1998 devastates Paul but also reveals his capacity for surviving loss, while maintaining his fundamental optimism about life's possibilities. As the new millennium approaches, Paul faces the strange reality of being a living legend, someone whose past achievements have become part of cultural history, while his current work continues pushing creative boundaries. The boy who learned to heal grief through melody has become an elder statesman of popular music. But his greatest challenge is learning to live with the knowledge that some relationships can never be fully resolved or replaced. 2024. At 82, Paul McCartney stands before 80,000 people at Wembley Stadium, the same venue where the Beatles played some of their most legendary performances 60 years earlier. When Paul begins the familiar piano introduction to Hey Jude, the entire stadium becomes a choir, 80,000 voices joining in a song that has somehow become a universal anthem of hope and connection. Music becomes immortality. This moment captures something essential about Paul McCartney's extraordinary legacy. He has created music that transcends its historical moment to become part of the fabric of human experience. Songs written by a grieving boy from Liverpool now serve as soundtracks for weddings and funerals, protests and celebrations, moments of joy and periods of grief across every continent and culture on Earth. The numbers are staggering. Over 100 million records sold as a solo artist, 29 #1 hits, induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice, a knighthood, recognition as the most successful songwriter in popular music history. But these achievements fail to capture the true scope of his cultural impact. Music becomes shared language. Paul's influence extends beyond commercial success to fundamental changes in how popular music functions as artistic expression. His work with the Beatles established that rock and roll could carry the emotional and intellectual weight traditionally reserved for classical music. His solo career proved that artists could maintain creative vitality across multiple decades. His approach to melody and harmony influenced countless musicians who drew inspiration from his ability to make complex musical ideas feel simple and accessible. Most significantly, Paul's songs have become vocabulary for expressing emotions that individuals struggle to articulate. Yesterday provides language for regret and loss. Let It Be offers comfort during uncertainty. Hey Jude transforms personal encouragement into collective celebration. These songs work not because they're musically sophisticated, though they are, but because they speak to universal human experiences with rare honesty and beauty. Music becomes eternal presence. The enduring power of Paul's music becomes evident in how it continues finding new audiences and contexts. Yesterday has been covered by artists ranging from Frank Sinatra to contemporary hip-hop producers. Let It Be serves as both spiritual anthem and protest song. Here Comes the Sun provides hope during literal and metaphorical dark periods in ways that continue surprising even Paul. His recent performances reveal an artist who has learned to embrace rather than fight his status as a living connection to music history. When he performs Beatles songs, he's not trying to recreate the past, but to demonstrate how that music continues living and evolving. His concerts become celebrations of both personal and collective memory, moments when individual nostalgia transforms into shared cultural experience. Music becomes wisdom. Paul's marriage to Nancy Shevell provided personal happiness that allows him to approach his legacy work with joy rather than obligation. The man who once struggled with the Beatles' end now seems genuinely grateful for the opportunity to serve as custodian of that music, to ensure it continues reaching people who need what it offers. His current projects reveal an artist who refuses to be limited by expectations about what someone his age should attempt. Recent albums incorporate contemporary production techniques while maintaining the melodic sensibility that has defined his work for 6 decades. Collaborations with younger artists demonstrate his continued relevance and ability to learn from musicians who grew up influenced by his songs. Music becomes legacy. As Paul enters his 80s, he embodies something rare in popular culture. An artist who has achieved iconic status while remaining genuinely likable and accessible. Unlike many contemporaries who became bitter or reclusive, Paul maintains the optimism and charm that originally made him famous. The last Beatle standing has become something more than a surviving member of a legendary band. He has become a living reminder that music can transcend its creators to become part of collective human experience. His songs will outlive him, but his example of how to age gracefully while maintaining creative vitality may prove equally lasting. Paul McCartney's story challenges conventional narratives about artistic success because it demonstrates that the most profound achievements often emerge not from grand gestures but from consistent dedication to craft, to connection, and to the belief that beauty matters even when the world seems determined to prove otherwise. The boy who sat at his mother's piano transforming grief into melody has spent 82 years proving that music can heal what seems beyond healing. that songs can unite what seems irreparably divided, and that sometimes the greatest gift an artist can give the world is simply the courage to keep playing when everything else falls silent. His greatest composition may not be any single song, but the life he has constructed from loss and love, from friendship and betrayal, from success and sorrow. A life that demonstrates how to transform personal experience into universal art, how to survive celebrity while maintaining humanity, how to grow old without losing the wonder that makes music possible. Music becomes eternal hope. In a world that often celebrates cynicism and despair, Paul McCartney's enduring optimism and musical generosity represent something precious. Proof that hope, expressed through melody, can indeed make the darkness a little less dark. The last Beatle standing is still playing, still believing, still proving that yesterday's pain can become tomorrow's healing when filtered through the enduring magic of melody and the unshakable faith that music will always find a way to save us all.